now going to move immediately to invite our panelists to come up if we may. And there are 6 of them. I'll say what their names are. If you could welcome them as they join the platform, I'd be very grateful. So firstly, Julia Deans, who's the CEO of the Toronto City Summit Alliance. Please welcome Julia. Secondly, the Honourable John Stefano, Mayor of the City of New Haven. Thirdly, Sir Richard Leese, the leader of Manchester, City of Manchester. Fourthly, Marnix Norder, Deputy Mayor of The Hague. Fifthly, Daniel de Torres, who's the Commissioner for Immigration and Intercultural Dialogue at the City of Barcelona. And then last but by no means least, Vijaya Vaidyanath, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Waitakere City Council in the Auckland region in New Zealand. So we've been talking to our panelists before the conference, and we said we wanted to begin by focusing on city leadership. And the way we're going to do this is essentially I'm going to ask them 4 questions, and in between their answers to questions 2 and 3, I'm going to throw it open for discussion in the room and try to get as many of you to contribute as possible. And the idea is that we've asked them to keep their remarks fairly brief so that you can really have a dialogue with them. So with that in mind, I'm going to kick off and say, firstly, panelists, welcome. It's a great honour to be with you this morning. I wanted you really just to start by telling us a little bit about how population flows and migration, both currently and historically, have shaped the population landscape of your city and added to its character. What is it that immigration has meant to your city over time? And Julia, some remarks from Toronto first, if you will.
Thank you. Is this on? Great. Good morning, everybody. I'll start off by saying that Toronto is the world's most diverse city. About 50% of our population was born in another country, and it's not focused on one dominant culture, so we have about 140 different cultures and ethnicities represented in our city, 200 languages. This is fairly recent compared to the history of some of your cities. We obviously had a native Canadian population, an Aboriginal population, and until World War II, our immigration was primarily from British countries or countries related to the British colonies. From World War II on, we had waves of different cultures coming to the city, starting with people of Jewish origin, Italians in the 50s, moving into the 70s, where we started to see more people from Caribbean cultures and South Asian cultures. And in the 80s, we had a large wave from East Asian countries. So we have a wonderful collection of ethnic communities in the Toronto region. The city of Toronto is about 3 million people, but we have a region of more like 6 or 7 million when you count the different municipalities and regions around, and one of our regional chairs is here today. Toronto receives the largest share of immigrants in Canada. About 40% of all immigrants to Canada come to Toronto, and that's about 100,000 people every year. So that's quite a big number, and all of our net labor force growth is going to come from immigration. What does this mean for our city? It means that it is the single biggest driver of our success, we believe, and it definitely shapes our identity as a city region. Right now, my organization is doing consultations on various subjects, and whatever the subject, people say that it is the single biggest influence on how successful we will be as a city. But perspectives do vary within our city. We have a mayoral election going on right now, and one of the leading candidates is running on an anti-immigration platform, which is quite troubling to many. We also are seeing newcomers being concentrated into certain areas of the city, which are not areas best able to serve their needs. In the past, most newcomers went to our downtown areas. There were settlement services fixed to help them. Now they're tending to go to areas that are out of the downtown core without the community services to support them, and that's an area many of us are looking at. We also have, like I think all of you, a national policy, very little coordination at the regional level locally. And we're seeing our economy changing so that in the past, when immigrants came with perhaps low skills, they could be very successful, and that's certainly not the case any longer. And that's of very real concern to many of us.
Julia, thank you very much indeed. And of course, we'll ask you about what can be done about that a little bit later on. Let's go to the City of New Haven and welcome the Honourable John Stefano. John, the floor is yours.
Good morning. How are you all? It's good to be with you all. I guess I want to say something about cities first, and it's an obvious and self-evident thing, but I think it's worth repeating. Cities are the places we come to do together what we can't do by ourselves. They are things that increase our value and worth not only as individuals but as societies. They are powerful and important things in our lives. I'd also acknowledge this, that as people come in, people also leave our cities, and I think it has to do with the central role of cities, of creating wealth in society and in people's lives. So the idea is populations come in, but oftentimes as they achieve financial success or other kinds of accomplishment, they move on to other places. In some ways, I like to think of cities not as destinations, but as passageways we go through to assimilate and to add value to our own lives. And I think that's reflected in immigration trends. Immigration has always been a factor in our community's life, not always to the same extent. If you went back to the turn of the last century, 1 out of 3 people in my city would have been an immigrant. Another half would have had an immigrant parent, and indeed the mayor of the city, one of my predecessors, the turn of the last century, was himself an immigrant. Immigration patterns have changed. Largely who has come has largely been a reflection of our economy. So at the turn of the last century, as manufacturing was important, we reflected that in who came to the country. We had another immigration. It was an internal immigration just before and after the Second World War, an African-American immigration from the southern part of our nation to the north. Today's immigration is a very diverse one. It does tend to get characterized, as it often is in the United States, as a brown immigration from the south. My largest employer, however, is a world-class research university. So in fact, a lot of our immigrants are highly trained technical people from many of your countries, many of whom we'd like to steal as many as we can. Largely because you've trained them and prepared them, and we'd like them adding value in our community, to be honest. So our population characteristics is now twofold in our city. Our view, and my view of political leadership, is to grow community and to acknowledge people who are adding value. We do not distinguish between who is documented and undocumented in our community. We distinguish upon whether they're civil contributing members of our community or indeed not. We do not have a clear coordination of policy with the national government, because the national government is, as many national governments are in matters of public policy, schizophrenic and inconsistent on their approaches to these kinds of things. I think as a general matter, immigration has been a powerfully good thing to increase markets, provide workers, and provide disproportionately entrepreneurial and innovative members of our community. And it's good to be here.
Great, thank you very much, the Honourable John Stefano. Let's move to Sir Richard Leese, the leader of Manchester.
Morning, everybody. Manchester is, perhaps like New Haven, an immigrant city. Its wealth was built on migrant labour. It became the greatest industrial city of the 19th century because it was prepared to welcome, indeed attract and welcome people from all over the world and welcome whatever talents they brought to the city. In the 19th century, most of that immigration came from Ireland and elsewhere in Europe, Southern Europe, Italy, France, and Eastern Europe, and within that Eastern Europe, a significant, Eastern and Central Europe, a significant Jewish population. But that is what the wealth of the city was built on. And as we came past the Second World War, old industrial cities like Manchester were already in decline. You can take the decline of Manchester as an industrial city probably back to the 1920s, and it was a long period of decline. Migration changed post-Second World War. It was largely from the British Commonwealth, the former colonial countries, a lot from India, Pakistan, the Indian subcontinent, also from Africa and also from the Caribbean. That was migration that came into a city that was in population decline. So becoming increasingly diverse, but in the 40 years between 1951 and 1991, the population of the city had declined by almost a half. That's partly to do with the way people live becoming differently, so people were no longer willing to accept the level of overcrowding that they might have done 40 years previously. It's also some of our neighbourhoods becoming hollowed out, massive losses of population that meant those neighbourhoods no longer were sustainable. Part of the strategy of the city for reversing that was to encourage people to come and live within the city. And I think there were a number of ways that we did that and a number of reasons why we did that. One of those has already been referred to a number of times, is that we recognise that just as 19th century Manchester had benefited from diversity, 21st century Manchester would benefit from diversity as well. So we wanted to actively encourage a diverse population. We wanted to attract talent, and the ways we did that, first of all, by reversing suburbanisation. Again, something being referred to is that we started to stop the trend of the more affluent people moving out of the city by starting to create neighbourhoods within the city that, as people became more affluent, they were willing to stay. In terms of attracting talent, we are a student city. We have, in undergraduate terms, the two largest universities in the United Kingdom. Those students, prior to the year 2000, more or less, once they graduated, they would go elsewhere to work. So again, one of the objectives was with students, and again, a very large number of international students, is first of all to attract that talent and then persuade that talent to stay. And the third area was continue migration, still from former colonial countries, from the Commonwealth, but increasingly from Eastern Europe and non-Anglophone Africa as well. Increasing number of French and Dutch-speaking people of African origin coming to the city. Net result of that is that in terms of objectives of economic growth, that Manchester is the one city, old industrial city, that's matched the best in terms of economic growth over the past decade or so, and a population that was in decline has now grown by over 10% over the last 8 years. It has created the odd issue as well, but we'll come to that later, Greg.
We will. Thank you very much, Sir Richard Leese.